A lot of times, after something traumatic has happened in a community, or there's been a national tragedy, you can hear calls for unity and reconciliation. That sounds right, doesn't it? There should be unity, and there should be reconciliation. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So that means Jesus' disciples should never be divisive, right? Well then, why did Jesus also say that becoming his disciple would divide families like a sword? Why did Jesus sometimes call religious leaders hypocrites? Wasn't Jesus a peacemaker? There's a lot of misconceptions about what peacemaking in the way of Jesus is and isn't. That's why in this video, I'm gonna bust 5 common peacemaking myths. Then I'm gonna ask you to do some peacemaking in your city. Let's go. Hey, what's up? I'm TC. I'm a Jesus disciple, urban minister, and theology nerd. Welcome to Theological Graffiti, where I introduce and break down subjects related to following the way of Jesus to help you grow and learn as his disciple. Sometimes I recommend resources like books or podcasts, and sometimes I interview theologians and urban ministers. If it's your first time checking out this channel, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you'll know when new videos drop. And if you're getting something out of this video, consider hitting the like button, leaving a comment, or becoming a supporter on Patreon. All right, that's enough of that. Back to myth busting. People that know just about anything about me know that peace is a big deal for me. They probably know that the peace church tradition of the Anabaptists has been a big influence on how I think about following Jesus. They probably know that I advocate for Jesus' way of nonviolence. And they probably know that my wife Oshida's first book was even called Shalom Sisters. So then some people get a little confused or shocked even when I weigh in on matters of social justice in politics. Some people are surprised, even upset, when I call out racism, misogyny, and economic injustice. They sometimes accuse me of violating my own emphasis on peace. They might see me making comments about a specific public policy and they say, "I thought you were a peacemaker. How does peacemaking fit into this?" This question shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what biblical peace is all about. And it's a common misunderstanding, even one that I unfortunately had too. But thankfully, through studying the scriptures, through listening to and learning from wise mentors and biblical scholars, and through advocacy with and for those who are experiencing injustice, I've been disabused of many unbiblical ways of thinking about peace. And now it's one of my favorite subjects. Let's go to the scriptures. Right here in the heart of Jesus' teachings, the famous Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness or justice, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." We can sometimes grow so familiar with these words that we stop hearing them. We end up imposing our own understanding of peacemaking onto Jesus' word. There was even a time not that long ago when I unconsciously invested peacemaking with my own faulty assumptions. I confused Jesus' way of peacemaking with what I'd been taught, which was all about peacekeeping, not peacemaking. So the first myth we're gonna bust is the myth that peacemaking is the same as peacekeeping. Notice how we often skip over the connection between peacemaking and persecution, right here in the Beatitudes. Jesus was a peacemaker, and yet he was also persecuted. Jesus concludes the Beatitudes with the fact that the prophets were also persecuted, so his disciples will be in good company. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. How can a prophet also be a peacemaker? The misunderstanding is that prophetic speech, such as speaking up for the oppressed, calling out injustice, isn't peaceful speech. Maybe it's cold comfort, but this isn't just a modern day misconception. People in Jesus' day had this misunderstanding too. And here's what Jesus says to address it. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household." See, Jesus differentiated his peace from the common misconception of peace. Going along, to get along. Jesus said his way of peace was also a sharp and poignant truth, a truth that even divides. When we've committed to the way of Jesus, it means that some folks won't be on our side anymore. The truth that Jesus is the Messiah, who brings God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, is a divisive truth. It's good news to those who embrace Jesus as their king. It's bad news to those who reject him and his kingdom. It's good news to those who look around at the world and recognize that it's broken, unjust, and in need of renewal. It's bad news to those who have a vested interest in preserving the unjust status quo because they benefit from it. Jesus teaches that the truth of his kingdom divides like a sword, and that some who end up on the other side might be members of our own families. Still, Jesus calls for our full allegiance. One time, a would-be disciple said that he would follow Jesus, but first he had to go bury his father. Jesus' response was, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Yikes! Kind of intense there, Jesus. Was Jesus not being a peacemaker? Listen to what Oshida wrote about the difference between peacemaking and peacekeeping. It's been a year of embracing my calling as a peacemaker and owning the conviction that peacemaking is more than gentle words and a humble attitude to avoid conflict when prophetic words and righteous indignation burns hot in my chest. If I do all that I can to avoid conflict, then I'm simply a peacekeeper, not a peacemaker. Sometimes I forget that we're not called to be peacekeepers. The children of God are made of sterner stuff than to merely keep the peace. No, Jesus challenges us to be peacemakers. The difference is subtle, but subversive. Peacekeeping maintains the unjust status quo by preferring the powerful. Peacemaking flips over a few tables and breaks out a whip when the poor are exploited. Peacekeeping does everything to secure a place at the table. Peacemaking says all are welcome to the table, that extends the table with leaves of inclusive love. Fear drives peacekeeping. Love powers peacemaking. Jesus was a peacemaker, and yet Jesus' peace was confrontational. And a lot of us don't like confrontation. We'd rather avoid it. Unfortunately, conflict avoidance isn't peacemaking. Do you see how this mistaking of peacemaking as peacekeeping is closely related to the myth that peacemaking is avoiding conflict? This might be a struggle for those of us who've been culturally conditioned to avoid conflict. Maybe you grew up in a family where you just didn't talk about those things. Or maybe you grew up with an abiding fear that if you rocked the boat or stepped out of line in any way, you could lose everything. You could be shunned. You could become an outcast. You could lose the people that mean the most to you, your family. So you learn to do everything in your power to avoid conflict. It's sort of like when you grow up in a family where there's an alcoholic or abusive parent, and everyone in the family would rather keep silent about it than confront that person. There's a strong belief that everything will just be better if we don't upset that person. So the disease or the abuse just gets worse and worse. That's not peacemaking. Jesus never shied away from confronting the social ills of his day. Jesus accused religious leaders who were considered holy and well-respected of being hypocrites and of abusing their power by preying upon the vulnerable. Mark 12 says, as he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Or what about the woes that Jesus pronounced upon the rich? "But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." Yikes! Calm down, Jesus. Someone's gonna think you're a socialist. The idea that Jesus was ever meek and mild is some kind of weird modern domestication of Jesus' prophetic voice. Anyone who simply reads the Gospels can see that Jesus was anything but meek and mild. Jesus, the peacemaker, was confrontational. Not only do we sometimes mistake peacemaking for conflict avoidance, we also sometimes mistake peacemaking for neutrality. Now, this mistake was a particularly attractive one for me. Neutrality can make you feel better than other people. It's like that old parable of the blind men holding different parts of the elephant in the dark and trying to describe it. Each person is wrong because they're only perceiving one part of the elephant. The person who mistakes peacemaking for neutrality imagines that they're like an objective observer who sees the whole elephant. They aren't blind like everybody else. And what's even more ironic is that often this posture of neutrality is even described as the humble one, when arguably it's the most arrogant position of all. But when we follow Jesus, we end up in the places that Jesus ended up, with the people that Jesus ended up with. And the more we love like Jesus loved, the more clearly we can see why Jesus identifies with those whose society overlooks, the afflicted, the imprisoned, the disenfranchised. We realize that Jesus wasn't neutral. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, the last, and the least. He didn't come for those who already thought they were well. He came for those who know they're sick. Jesus, the Word incarnate, God in the flesh. To show us what God is like, he came as a poor peasant member of a conquered and occupied people group. He lived his life on the margins of society, not in the seat of power. He didn't have to die on the cross as a criminal, but that's the life of love he chose to reveal God's love. Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor who went on to become a prolific and celebrated author. He once wrote this: "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." You see, peacemaking is messy and requires courage. We're not called to sit on the sidelines or fade into the background. We're not called to preserve the status quo or business as usual. We're called to be peacemakers. Dr. King also understood this in the context of the struggle for Black freedom and civil rights in America. He once wrote this: "I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, the absence of tension, to a positive peace, the presence of justice." Being on the side of peace means we aren't neutral. Like Jesus, we're on the side of the oppressed. But I can already hear people saying, "But TC, doesn't peacemaking mean we listen to one another and try to understand each other?" Of course it does. I think hearing one another's stories is a vital part of peacemaking. When we hear one another's stories, it can build our empathy for one another. We might find important common ground that helps us move towards one another. I see an example of this in the life of Jesus when he dialogued with the Pharisee named Nicodemus, who came to him at night. Jesus didn't rebuke him, as he regularly did the other Pharisees, who publicly tried to trap him. No, he received Nicodemus and spoke with him directly and graciously. But there's a couple of critically important caveats that need to be inserted right about here. Peacemaking doesn't mean having no boundaries. It's psychologically unhealthy for a person who has experienced significant trauma to continually subject themselves to re-traumatization. Our calling to be peacemakers doesn't mean that we have to constantly relive our trauma by listening to those who hold dehumanizing, toxic, or abusive positions. That's not peacemaking. It's not peacemaking to be a sponge for toxicity. It's not peacemaking to be a doormat. This is especially true for our sisters and brothers who are part of minority groups. It's not being a peacemaker for them to be constantly subjected to the views of people who further stigmatize, stereotype, and denigrate their identities. I think of this quote that has often been attributed to James Baldwin, which says, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." For those who publicly propped up the oppressive power structures of his day, Jesus had nothing but words of judgment. He publicly called them to repent or face the judgment of God. But don't make the mistake of thinking that just because Jesus was a prophet, he wasn't also a peacemaker. And don't make the mistake of thinking that modern day prophets aren't also peacemakers too. Sometimes this false dichotomy between peacemaking and the prophetic call to repentance leads people to the false notion that peacemaking requires us to ignore facts or even create false equivalencies. This is called Bothsidesing. The reality is that very often, two sides of an issue are not equally right or wrong. One side is just wrong. And the compulsion to find middle ground can lead people to destroy peace rather than make it. Remember this: halfway between the truth and a lie is still a lie. Isaac Asimov was a brilliant scientist and prolific writer who taught at Boston University. He once received a letter from an English literature student named John, who wanted to school Asimov in science. The letter writer objected to Asimov's assertion that modern science had made important advancements into understanding the nature of the universe over previous eras. Here's what Asimov writes back: "The young specialist in English Lit, having quoted me, went on to lecture me severely on the fact that in every century, people have thought they understood the universe at last, and in every century, they were proved to be wrong. It follows that the one thing we can say about our modern knowledge is that it's wrong. The young man then quoted with approval what Socrates had said on learning that the Delphic oracle had proclaimed him the wisest man in Greece. "If I am the wisest man," said Socrates, "it is because I alone know that I know nothing." The implication was that I was very foolish because I was under the impression I knew a great deal. My answer to him was this: John, when people thought the world was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the world was spherical, they were wrong. But if you think that thinking the earth is spherical is just as wrong as thinking the earth is flat, then your view is wronger than both of them together. The mistake that John makes is the same mistake that many people still make today when it comes to peacemaking. They think that both sides must be equally wrong or equally right, and that the best position is to basically pretend we're not wise enough to know the difference. But as Asimov demonstrates, that's simply nonsense. Truth is not so elusive that we can't stand on the facts that are right in front of our faces. And to be honest, those who make this argument against biblical peacemaking often cherry-pick the truths that they find obvious and the truths that inexplicably can't be known by anyone. Esau Macaulay is an African-American Anglican priest and a professor at Wheaton. He studied with N.T. Wright in Scotland for his doctorate. He writes about this in his new book, Reading While Black. What then does peacemaking involve? And what does it have to do with the church's political witness? Biblical peacemaking involves assessing the claims of groups in conflict and making a judgment about who is correct and who is incorrect. Peacemaking then cannot be separated from truth-telling. The church's witness does not involve simply denouncing the excesses of both sides and making moral equivalencies. It involves calling injustice by its name. If the church is going to be on the side of peace in the United States, then there has to be an honest accounting of what this country has done and continues to do to Black and brown people. Moderation, or the middle ground, is not always the loci of righteousness. Housing discrimination has to be named. Unequal sentences and unfair policing has to be named. Sexism and the abuse and commodification of the Black female body has to end. Otherwise, any peace is false and unbiblical. Beyond naming, there has to be some vision for the righting of wrongs and the restoration of relationships. The call to be peacemakers is a call for the church to enter the messy world of politics and point towards a better way of being human. One of the reasons why we often make these mistakes about peacemaking is because we have faulty mental models. Here's one of them. We imagine that the divisions that we need to overcome are horizontal on the same plane. There are some on one side of the plane, let's call them the left side, and there are others on the other side, let's call that the right side. In this mental model, the division that exists is on a horizontal spectrum. It imagines that if we could just meet in the middle, then we'd have peace. But the fundamental problem with this mental model is that we aren't all on the same plane, whether left or right. This mental model presumes that everyone is on equal footing, having equal status relative to others. But that's not the biblical model. In the biblical model of peace, some are unjustly disadvantaged while others are unjustly advantaged. They aren't starting on the same plane at all. Some hold a position in society over and above others. So the way to peace in the biblical model isn't merely meeting in the middle. It's the high and mighty being brought low and the downtrodden being lifted up. Shalom isn't achieved until everyone is brought to the same level, regardless of where they fall on some kind of right or left spectrum. The shalom of God isn't just people agreeing to disagree or maintaining a truce. No, the shalom of God is when God's dream for humanity is realized. That is, all of humanity reigning together on God's behalf as God's representatives, stewarding the earth's resources as the gifts they are, caring for all God's creatures as precious, and honoring one another as fellow divine image bearers. That means sharing resources with one another in society and celebrating our God-given diversity. Everyone belongs, everyone has all they need, and everyone lives out of the fullness of God's life in and through them. Peacemaking confronts everything short of God's dream and builds towards the day when God's shalom is fully established on earth as it is in heaven. My goal is to help you learn and grow as disciples of Jesus. So, in the description below, I have links to some of the resources that I've mentioned in this video. Check those out. But I'm also going to ask you to do two more things. I'm going to ask you to go and learn peacemaking by doing it. Get messy in your context. Find some good trouble to get into. Speak up for those who are being treated unjustly. And come alongside ministries and charities that are already doing that work. Learn from them and serve those on the margins. Then you'll learn peacemaking the way Jesus taught it, by doing it. I'm also going to ask you to write a comment below about where you learned peacemaking and the ministries and charities in your city that are doing that kind of work, advocating for the oppressed the way that Jesus did. That way, others can join in the work that you and I are already doing. Until next time, Peace.